So far, so good. This motif of the depositary and the split of the subject at the is where we left off. As Lacan does, he locates like a seemingly uh, minor reference in Kant. We tracked down and then we read the full reference, which actually was, I think, appeared as a footnote in the Critique of Practical Reason, and that this elucidates this idea of the what is it, the bank man depositing and the moral conundrum, if I'm not mistaken, around this. But somebody, maybe Luis or Matilda, you could articulate in simple terms what this example was that Kant discusses, and then we can see the formal split between enunciating subject and the subject of enunciation, of rather of the statement. Who wants to remind us exactly how this
Oh,
appears in Kant's critique?
I think um I think Kant is doing like proposing various ways to come up with moral laws, and this one I think Lacan describes it as like an analytic technique to come up to figure out the moral law, whereas de Sade has the like a more like a synthetic one. But I think basically that um,
I
there is no
remember. I remember.
deposit. There is
Yes.
no deposit without a depositor who's faithful, and so there's like an imperative to be a faithful depositor, I believe.
Yeah,
And
exactly. It shows the inevitability of the splitness of the subject through the commandment, which is instantiated in the voice, whereby one never in the Kantian universe is capable of like self-ownership. It's you're always split. It's always hetero. So the field of
yes,
the other is like an always present, always there, and this splitness is apparent in the same ethics of the imperative, which is the foundation of deontological ethics. That is the foundation of Kantian ethics, the idea of following an imperative irrespective of situation, irrespective of the pathology of the situation, right? Because
yeah,
empiricism is a dirty thing, which is why the Kantian ethical worldview is moralistic in a way which is pure. And then a lot of Marxists will chastise that purity. Yeah. Right.
yeah.
And so the error of the Kantian ethical position, you can say in general, is the fact that it's subtracted from, yeah, like any necessity to have a rational assessment of the given situation.
Yeah, I
Um,
think.
Go ahead.
Oh, I think like kind of overall, there's like different substantial goals that are like he calls them like pathological, like things that we're interested in that um, that are related to like substantial needs or substantial desires, like and that like once we kind of like pare away like the materiality of our goals, like we encounter an imperative or something. I think that was
Mm,
one way he described it. And de Sade has like the imperative that he ends up coming up with that Lacan prefers is that it puts somehow it exposes the split in the subject, because like his imperative of to enjoy is like given to the other,
mm,
like the right to another person like having a claim to anybody or something. And so it's not like, and also I think one aspect that he liked about de Sade was that like de Sade's imperative isn't tested against like whether or not it's like the whole depositor thing that is like, can society continue to function if
yeah.
there's like unfaithful depositors? And he's like, no, things would break down. It's kind of like his famous example with like honesty. Like the imperative to be honest is kind of derived from like what would happen to society, whereas this one that Desaad comes up with seems to avoid this test regarding like the social outcomes. So it's more pure in a certain way, and it kind of, I think, part of why the Desaad imperative like exposes the split is because it's more pure in some regard.
Yeah, it's more pure, but as we get to in a moment, um, it's not exactly true because in a certain way, what is this about? It's also not only an ethics of the imperative, it's also about an establishment of a law for humanity. So it's about a kind of universal appeal to the human. Um, and Kant kind of grounds all of that um, in a conception of like the dignity of the human. And of course, we talked last time about how all of that is like foundational to the international institutions of human rights. They are very, very deeply Kantian in a certain way. But Lacan will say in a moment that all of that still is reliant on Kant's category of the noumenon, of the unknowable, technically third object. And there's an interesting conversation there because he's basically saying that, well, the conception of the human, according to de Sade, presupposes something like a suffering human, which is a very interesting point that he brings about vis-a-vis the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who, if you're not aware, I only know him because of my love affair with Nietzsche. It was Nietzsche's favorite Stoic, and this figure was enslaved the majority of his life, but kind of created this insidious rationale for the persistence of slavery, irrespective of the conditions that slavery does to the body. Now you can see why Nietzsche likes him. A lot of Nietzscheans are shy to really understand why he likes Epictetus, but it actually has to do with the fact that he's a Stoic philosopher who effectively justifies slavery. So I found it interesting, you'll see here in a moment, that they saw it as doing another operation similar to that. And again, Adorno and Horkheimer are never shy to make the association between Nietzsche and de Sade. So there could be something to explore in that regard. Go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, I also think that when he talks about the analytic deduction, right, it has to do with the fact that not only the imperative follows a universal commandment, but that the subject itself needs to be, when enunciates the commandment, it needs to do it from a position of unconditional freedom, right? And but of course, this, in a way, he will later explain, represses desire, right? And in Sade, this is pretty much this openly displayed, right, in the relationship between the executioner and the victim, right? And so there we have this split that is openly displayed, right? Well, in the case of Kant, it is confused, or it is occultated, right? Because it's based on the inner voice, right? Yeah, because this split that of the analytic deduction, or the analytic deduction tries to hide the split between the enunciating subject and the subject of the statement, right? And I think that if we reach the graphs, the first graph, it will explain that better. So I'll just shut up right now.
Yeah, the split is concealed, uh, which I think is related to the point about the incorporation of what Lacan will call kind of like a materialist transcendental in this well, ultimately in Desade's conception of the human subject in a certain way. Andrew.
Yeah, I found this like the sections that we read in the last session to be really insightful, and some of the speculations I have in mind is like, this relationship with this asymmetrical one, as like Miller will say that of Kant and Sade, like Sade's the truth of Kant. Because like when I think of like Kantian ethics, not just the categorical imperative or doing one's duty, um, or universalizing one's maxim, but also that others, like people or like friends, or just people in general, are ends and not means to an end. Because then it kind of brings up a peculiar question of mine of like, okay, so if Sade is a Kantian in a sense, I agree with what actually was saying, like, he's just a Kantian, just in a normal way, like in a weird way. Um, to enjoy the right to enjoy one's body, is that not like also a reversal of the Kantian ethic of people are ends to people are means to an end, right? And it also kind of brings up other speculations that I won't go too far in because I like to get to the text. Since Kant's relationship with Christianity versus Sade, who's vehemently opposed to Christianity. In some sense, there is a sort of secular or rationalization via the Enlightenment with Kant's ethics as like a sort of abstraction of a rational kernel from Christianity versus Sade, in that regard, with people as ends versus means to an end.
Yeah, I mean, the presupposition of the kingdom of ends presupposes a utopian community. This is Goldman's point in his book on Kant from a Marxist point of view. See, you can't, which is why like the most harsh disavowals of that come from liberal Kantians. Because liberal Kantians think that all of this unconditional freedom and its maximization can exist within the status quo, and like, so like, they are, you can see the ideological operation is perverse and obscene because they are fine to disregard context. But that's not Kant's position, actually. Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? So just a couple of things. First of all, I think it's interesting that Sade's maxim and Long Live Poland like reveal this like Kantian ethical position. And what's interesting about both of those maxims, the Sadian one and Long Live Poland, is that they're jokes. They're both jokes. Like they're both like being revealed through humor, according to Lacan, which is interesting, and it just makes me think of what just sort of like a theme in Adorno and Horkheimer that I personally find really interesting. They have a lot to say about like laughter and like laughing at jokes, which is which for like Adorno and Horkheimer is often a response to like fear and power, but that's a digression. But I also just wanted to kind of meditate a little bit more on at the very beginning of this text. Lacan's really interested in, well, wants to make an analogy between the Sadian bedroom and the academy, right? And the positions we occupy in those places. And so, right, returning to the bedroom, Lacan's going to say there's no such thing as like an equivalent position in the bedroom, right? And rather, instead, we have a position in regard to ourselves in the bedroom. This is sort of what following the maxim is. We're sort of othering ourselves. So was getting lost here, or I anticipate this is probably going to come up, but what position are we occupying in relation to our partner in the bedroom is still very ambiguous, right? So yeah, it's just very strange too, because again, like this othering and subjecting ourselves to the rule, can that only happen in the bedroom or something? So I'm still just sort of like working through what's going on there.
You're muted, Daniel.
In this section, Onward Frenchman, the manifesto from Philosophy in the Bedroom that Lacan's chiefly responding to, one does not get that impression, actually, as far as I can tell. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, if your question is, does de Sade literally suggest that, or is Lacan wanting to make a more abstract claim that really this only works on condition that that this is the ground of the imperative ethics of the Sade. Maybe he's saying something like that. But again, I was struck by how he's really trying to talk about this as an ethical imperative in society for citizens, as homage to what the revolution must continue. So I don't know if that we can get to these things. Let's go to Maton and then let's immediately go to the text.
Sure, I just wanted to answer Connor's question at the end there, whether this self-othering only takes place in the bedroom. And my response is, I read it in the Critique of Practical Reason. Pardon me, I'm a little bit out of it, but Kant actually uses the surgery room as an example of another place where this can happen. And I was reading Danny Nobis's book. He gives this example, where at the time where Kant was writing the Critique of Practical Reason, there was no, I don't know what the correct term is off, anesthesiology, the way to any like decent painkillers. So, I mean, he used this example of, choosing against your self-interest in not being hurt to elect yourself for a surgery that is necessary, life-saving or I don't know, labor-saving. It'll be very helpful for you. And so what de Sade is essentially like completing with this is, the delight in evil, which we start with, which Lacan started Kant with Sade with. In which case we can consider evil, yes, in this like social sense, where it doesn't have to be necessarily immediately cognized as evil, but in some broader sense, in some long-term notion of health that is being like presupposed, like in the case of the bank, right? It's being presupposed there. So the depositary, it's already like kind of part of its predicate that it's trustworthy and that it's part of this process.
Very interesting. Okay, so we are at pagination 771. To confirm this view, one need but consider. I think that's where we are, right? Does that sound good to you, Maton?
Yeah. To confirm this view, one need but consider the doctrine with which Sade himself establishes the reign of his principle, the doctrine of human rights. He cannot use the notion that no man can be the property or in any way the prerogative of another man as a pretext for suspending everyone's right to enjoy him, each in his own way. The constraint
what is the footnote? If we're going to read this slow, we're going to read this slow. Number 4.
It's Philosophy in the Bedroom, the complete series, volume 3.
It's okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, please.
Oh, sure thing. The constraint he endures here is not so much one of violence as of principle. The problem for the person who makes it into a sentence not being so much to make another man consent to it as to pronounce this consent in his place. Thus, the discourse of the right to jouissance clearly posits the other as free, the other's freedom as its enunciating subject, in a way that does not differ from the to s, which is evoked out of the lethal depths fondant of every imperative. And just briefly, I'm thinking of a signifier represents a subject for another signifier. Here he's kind of like connecting that to the, I don't know, the psychoanalytic experience of seeing another person unknowingly demonstrate a symptom. And I'll just keep going. But this discourse is no less determinant for the subject of the statement, giving rise to him with each addressing of its equivocal content. Since the jouissance, shamelessly avowed in its very purpose, becomes one pole in a couple, the other pole being in the hole that jouissance already drills in the other's locus, in order to erect the cross of Sadean experience in it, to pronounce consent in its place. Leaving off my discussion of its mainspring here, let me recall instead of that pain which projects its promise, of ignominy here, merely intersects the express mention of it made by Kant among the connotations of moral experience. What pain is worth in Sadean experience will be seen better by approaching it via What might be disconcerting in the artifice the Stoics used with regard to it? Scorn. Imagine.
So sorry. So just taking a step back. So the double operation of jouissance on the subject is one. Its main function is shame. So it's an operation which, by its very operation, we remember, even in Seminar 17, makes a hole in the other, right? Insofar as there's a problem in Kant because he can't account for the way that jouissance splits the subject. As he says, already drills in the other's locus in order to erect the cross of Sadean experience in it. Okay, so that's not exactly clear yet, but does anybody have any questions about that
could I-
passage?
I was
Go ahead.
just gonna add, like, so if this is drills in the other's locus in order to erect the cross of Sadian experience. So like, you know, the Sadian experience would be bearing the faith. So like not necessarily Sade himself, but the Sadian experience and its logic is a perversion because it bears the faith that there is an other who enjoys and it plugs the hole. But it also needs a subject, right, to sort of enact that, because the Sadian or the pervert in this sense is like is just an instrument, right, to plug the other. So in this sense,
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
What I'm trying to understand though, because you brought up shame, it makes me think.
Well, it's strange to say that shamelessly avowed,
right.
in its very purpose, which is the unique fact of the whole imperative itself. That becomes one pole in a couple, the other one being in the hole that jouissance already drills in the other's locus. Okay.
Yeah, and well, because what I understand is like clinically wise, when you get a pervert in the clinic and you get them to acknowledge something where they cannot disavow, shame is evoked, and there is a hole in the other where they realize they can't plug in, to where they're sort of reduced to an object themselves, to where they stand themselves. Like it's not guilt like a neurotic, it's complete shame and disgust, is what I've heard in clinical commentary regarding perversion in a Lacanian sense.
Okay, very good. So far, so good. We can continue. I think you left off on scorn.
Yep. Scorn. The next page, 651. Imagine a revival of Epictetus in Sadean experience. You see, you broke it, he says, pointing to his leg, to reduce jouissance to the misery of an effect in which one's quest stumbles. Doesn't this transform it into disgust? This shows that jouissance is that by which Sadean experience is modified. For it only proposes to monopolize a will after having already traversed that will in order to instate itself at the inmost core of the subject whom it provokes beyond that by offending his sense of modesty. For modesty is an amboceptor with respect to the circumstances of being. Between the two, the one's immodesty by itself violating the other's modesty. A connection that could justify, were such a justification necessary, what I said before regarding the subject's assertion in the other's place. Let us question this jouissance, which is precarious because it depends on an echo that it sets off in the other, only to abolish it little by attaching the intolerable to it. In the end, doesn't it seem to us to be thrilled only by itself, like another horrible freedom?
Okay, so back to Epictetus. So Epictetus broke his leg as a slave, and in the arrangement in which his fate, because he spoke a lot about this Stoic conception of, it's where Nietzsche gets amor fati from Epictetus. To reduce jouissance to the misery of an effect in which one's quest stumbles, doesn't this transform it into disgust? So he's saying that some operation is happening here because disgust would be an effect of shame. And what is the difference between shame and modesty? Modesty is the strategy in which you keep shame at bay, I think. It's like a container for shame. You don't want shame to run amok. So what I'm confused about here is how the operation of the Sadean intervention is affecting modesty. Are people clear on this?
Can I say
Matilda.
something? Yeah.
Yeah, please.
I'm just gonna like repeat the Sadean maxim. It's in quotes, I have a right to enjoy your body. Anyone can say to me. Anyone can say to me, I have a right to enjoy your body. So he's placing the imperative like in the other by saying anyone can say to me this thing rather than like it coming from the individual. And that seems in a certain way, like one can't live the will to jouissance. Like, so you have to put it in the other. And perhaps like the Sadian form of the maxim, like brings out the aspect of like shame and modesty. Perhaps it would be like too shameless to like live the like will to jouissance. Or perhaps it's like not even conceivable within like Lacan's imagination or something.
Okay, that's helpful. He says, for modesty is an ambiceptor with respect to the circumstances of being. Between the two, the one's immodesty, by itself violating the other's modesty. This is a connection that could justify were such justification necessary, what I said before regarding the subject's assertion in the other's place. So it's almost as if the presupposition of the rights of enjoying the other's body seems to, as he says here, allow for jouissance to have a kind of a modification within the relationship between the two parties that are engaging in this maxim. And then moreover, perhaps others would disagree, modesty is almost like retained, which is immediately not intuitive or counterintuitive. What do you think, Connor?
Yeah, I think why this is sort of like problematic for me so far is I think it turns on a question of repression, whether or not repression is here and how it's operating, because I don't think it is. It seems as though Lacan wants to say it's not. And what I mean by that is earlier in the reading, he said something like, the law is not imposed on people and how the law is constituted. And by that, I'm understanding it as a question of repression. But rather, there is instead this emphasis on freedom, that instead we can assume the maxim of the law, right? People don't enact the law because they're scared or what have you, right? They do it because they want to do it. They have the freedom to do it. So I think that's sort of like the ambiguous thing going on so far for me, or is this sort of like concealing how repression is working? Is repression still working or is it not working? So I think that's sort of the strange thing about the Sadean law. It's constituted by freedom rather than repression. So it's like, that's what I'm thinking through at least.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Andrew, please jump in.
Was it my hand up that was up first or Luis's?
Oh, so Luis. It's Luis. My bad. Luis.
Well, I think that, I mean, it will be a way to jump to the graph already, but in a simple sense, when the Sadean cross that he talks at the beginning, right? I mean, that's a split subject, right? So in a simple sense, how is this Sade is enjoying is by making the victim suffer, right? By humiliating the victim, right? And that's pretty much how the superego works, right? The superego makes you feel worthless, right? You are not enough, right? Makes you feel disgraced and humiliated, right? And this is pretty much how the Sade is interacting with the other, right? Because precisely the fantasy when we reach the graph is inverted, right? And the Sade takes the place of the object A, right? So on the other hand, we have the cross. The other is cross, right? So that's we have a relationship. But yeah, when we reach the graph, that will be better.
Yeah, that's very helpful. My confusions will be resolved momentarily. Andrew, and then we'll go back to reading.
Yeah, I'll make it quick, but like, yeah, I think when I think of like this, like, you know, this subject of the law of enjoyment, living to the fullest in the Sadian sense, like, you know, with its effect on modesty, it's because it's, you know, not only like, you know, being cruel or creating a victim, but also like how explicit one can be with their own sense of sexual enjoyment as a law. Like there is like a lack like of modesty, or modesty becomes sort of like null because of the extent that you express, like especially in the philosophy in the bedroom, how much they're expressing or boasting about their knowledge of sexual enjoyment. And I'll just conclude with this. This isn't necessarily modesty, this is hospitality, but I think in a way, modesty and hospitality intertwine with this. Like, you know, for hospitality, when you go to somebody's house, like, oh, would you like something to eat? Would you like some water? And you say, no, thank you. But like, you know, they have to throw that offer on the table. And sometimes they'll be like, no, please, I insist. I make the best such and such or the best sweet tea, right? That's hospitality. And sometimes you have to insist. So you reluctantly say, yeah, I'll do it. Now, where the modesty aspect comes in is with the Sade experience. And here I go back to the a Wild at Heart example, where both of those are intertwined, because William Dafoe literally forces himself onto the girl, and he's like saying in her ear, fuck me, so that she will finally expose herself and whisper it back. And she whispers back saying, fuck me. And he's like, well, I'd love to, maybe another time. Thank you for the offer, but I'll do it later. And he leaves. So there's, in a sense, where modesty and hospitality meet, where like the law of enjoyment meets like at like a Sadian level.
Yeah,
makes sense. But it's
well, I
like
think the whole
like
I think the whole justification of modesty is thrown out in the Sidean universe. Is sort of, he says the justification is no longer necessary, right?
Mhm.
So it sort of solves the problem in a certain way. But let us continue, because now we're getting to the philosophically rich point about the noumenon aspect here. Please continue.
Thus, we will see appear the third term that, according to Kant, is lacking in moral experience, and but thereby the subject, the split in the subject, namely the object that Kant, in order to guarantee it to the will in the implementation of the law, is constrained to relegate to the unthinkability of the thing in itself. But is this not the very object we find in Sadean experience, which is no longer inaccessible and is instead revealed as the being in the world, the Dasein of the tormenting agent? Yet it retains the opacity of that which is transcendent, for this object is strangely separated from the subject. Let us observe that the herald of the maxim need be no more here than a point of broadcast. It could be a voice on the radio recalling the right promoted by the supplemental effort the French would have consented to make in response to Sade's appeal, the maxim having become an organic law of their regenerated republic. Such a voice-related phenomenon, especially those found in psychosis, truly have this object-like appearance. And in its early days, psychoanalysis was not very far.
Like Schreber's God, right? Because he is channeling Rousseau here in the supreme being, right? In a certain way, because precisely it's some anonymous voice that kind of, you could think, just sort of is broadcast for all citizens to adhere to, or something like that. Which is why I was slightly confused about the prior conversation about the specificity of the scene, of the situation, of the surgery room, of the classroom, of the bedroom. I'm not really reading it like that, precisely because Kantian ethics itself is not situationally. But whatever, we can move to that later.
Well, no, I'm fine talking about this. I think what I end up getting, like, to adjust that is that it's not situationally, like, the fact that it isn't situationally, like, determined because it's a categorical imperative has more to do with the method staging a negation. It has to separate itself from the pathological, and in order to prove itself, if like proof is demanded,
I see.
It has to like prove that you can add a pathological content to it as a way of demonstrating the purity of the method.
Right. But here he makes the beautiful point, which
Yep.
is exactly what Desade is after politically, that it must become the organic law of the regenerated republic.
And I'll continue. Oh, please.
What do you mean?
Very interesting, by the way, that like how much, even like in like sci-fi and like popular portrayals of like I'm even thinking of like Mad Max and like, or even like Dune, and these like strange like figures of commandment that are always like excessively drowned in jouissance, like the Harkonnen rotund figure in Dune, and like the way that his voice when he speaks to the people at the Colosseum in Dune, it very has like a kind of this kind of idea of this weird voice. Anyways, go on, Matilda.
Can I say something? Yeah. That paragraph that says, "Thus we will see appear the third term." So, I suppose like the good, which is kind of like perhaps the object of the moral law, is like very insubstantial in Kant. And in the Sadian experience, or Sadian experience, the good, is he saying that here the good is the tormenting agent? And in a certain regard, like in Kant, like there is quite a bit of torment in trying to perform the moral law in order to like attain the good. So I could see how the good could be tormenting in some regard. But I guess like on the other hand, like the Sadian experience, like what seems to torment is that one has given the other the right to violate whoever in order to exercise their jouissance or their desire. But in Sade, like the whole construction is like, if you want a nation of freedom, if you want to avoid being subjugated again, you have to follow this type of law system. And it's persuasive in some regards, that pamphlet.
Yeah. It's really weird.
It's very strange.
It's so fucking weird. And it's why he can still, I guess you could call it the good, because he's not afraid to use that word. The Desade uses that word, which again goes back to like Akshay's point that, it's very difficult to categorize Desade along these classical structures. It's like, oh, he's clearly perverse primarily. It's much more ambiguous. Okay. So far, so good. This is a good pace. Shall we go? Go on, Maton.
Here we see why Kant views this object as evading every determination of transcendental aesthetics, even though it does not fail to appear in a certain bulge in the phenomenal veil, being not without hearth or home, time and intuition, modality situated in the unreal or effect in reality. It is not simply that Kant's phenomenology is lacking here, but that the voice, even if insane, forces upon us the idea of the subject, and that the object of the law must not suggest malignancy on the part of the real God. Christianity has assuredly taught men to pay little attention to God's jouissance, and this is how Kant makes palatable his voluntarism of law for law's sake, which is something that exaggerates, one might say, the ataraxia of the Stoics. One might be tempted to think that Kant feels pressured here by what he hears too close by, not from Sade, but from some nearby mystic, in the sigh that muffles what he glimpses beyond, having seen that his God is faceless. Grimmigkeit, Sade says, supremely evil being. But
yeah, that's really good. I mean, there is an element when you study Kantian ethics of a Aristotelianism of the good, insofar as Kant does speak about the strengthening of the will through its constant testing and maximizing. So there is that possibility. It's not like therefore you could make a kind of rapprochement or a bridge to something like a virtue ethics, perhaps. And I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, that this concept of ataraxia is one that Kant flirts with in his writings as well. Please, Luis.
Well, I mean, Kant is not a Stoic, right? Neither an Epicurean, right? So precisely because, and this is an essential part of the beginning of this text, right? Because when he claims that Sade opened the path for Freud's pleasure principle, but Kant started it, right? And that's precisely because with Kant, there is no union between the good and the pleasurable, right? The highest good is not possible in the world, right? It must be presupposed as a regulative idea, it must be in the afterlife, right? And this is contrary to what the Stoics, right, and the Ataraxia and the Epicureans, right, will claim that if you follow, for example, if you follow the Stoics, if you follow virtue, you will find happiness, or the Stoics, if you find happiness, you will find a way to deal with pleasure, with unpleasure, right? Kant, on the contrary, rejects those positions, right, which allows them for Sade to if, right, there is no correct path to reach pleasure or to reach happiness, right, then Sade has an open terrain to do whatever he wants, right? And that's what is then problematic is that Sade, although he's not in a certain way following the moral law, reaches a level of producing a moral law, right? And with that, following desire, right? By following his own desire, he reaches a level of producing a moral law, and this is what we see with him evident of a desire within the imperative, right? Which Kant cannot conceive because the moral law is unconditionally good. There is not sensible desire, right? As there's no sensible inclinations, right? So Kant needs to repress desire. The law for Kant is repressed, while in Sade is completely unbound, right? So this is what Sade reveals now, here, right? And this is what's so interesting about the voice of Sade when the sadist goes and tells you do this, right? You can clearly see that there is a desire within this imperative, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. That's very good. It's the distinction is often drawn that I draw when I teach ethics between willing the good versus willing happiness. And the Aristotelian version would be on the side of a willing of a happiness. But some Kantians have argued that there still is an implied ataraxia through the willing of the good. And I think what's interesting here is that de Sade is sticking to Kant's side. He's not falling into eudaimonia or this Greek Aristotelian idea of the overall ethics as about preservation of overall well-being of the subject. So he's staying at a formalistic point, just as Kant is doing, but he's not foreclosing desire and pleasure. Please, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with all of that. I guess like the word that's coming up for me is sort of like equanimity, or sort of like and I guess like where the strikes seem different. I mean, not that I know anything about them, but like in the sense that at least what that word brings up, I guess, is the sense of measure, proportion, like knowing the sort of right amount. Whereas like with both Sade and Kant, there's like this, it's precisely that sort of that common sense of like measure that's like discarded. So I mean, with Sade, you could almost go like, oh, modesty is like a feudal virtue, because like modesty is about like a sense of right measure and proportion in one's dealings with other people. Like what Andrew was saying about hospitality, right? Like it's part of knowing when not to press and what not to take, kind of. Whereas like Sade would take everything literally in like this like voracious way, but precisely because he has like contempt for this like old society of modesty. Like I mean, yeah, again, like this is not a celebration Sade, but I think that's sort of like the associations there.
Well, that certainly tracks with what we studied in seminar 17 about Lacan's claim about claims about modesty, which he links back to the feudal period. Yeah. Because modesty is about the preservation of social rank and order. And I think this Sadean libertine gesture itself is fundamentally disruptive to rank and social order on the one hand. On the other hand, modesty becomes like no longer a problem for the subject. As I read that very difficult little paragraph on 651. But once we get to the schema 1 on 653, we should be able to clarify that a little bit more. Still quite elusive. I'm obsessed with Lacan's comments on shame and modesty. Precisely because he does a wonderful thing of historicizing them. And so, like, this guy One Dime, Tony, the YouTube sensation.
Tony.
Yeah, Tony and I are trying to create a YouTube video about the history of shame, using Lacan's idea of shame, right? But like totally explaining it for the masses. It's something I'm obsessed with. Because you remember that whole point about this figure from the feudal times who followed the Kantian imperative of shame by committing suicide, not when he was shamed, but when his master was shamed. Right? So he like fell on the cross of the preservation of a society of shame, which is like a society that is superior insofar as it's like stable. It's like very well ordered. Everything's in its right place. I think I find that anecdote very interesting. I forget the figure's name. I can bring it up. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah. No, I'm curious now what the figure's name was, because that was just recent that we read that. I'll keep it short just because so we can get back to the text. But Akshay made up a good point about measurement and in terms of modesty, and just again what the whole theme of like what we've been reading so far is, because it made me think again, if we're talking about like if we're relating this back to what Lacan's whole thing about the subject of jouissance and the law of enjoyment and desire, it makes me think again about the process of jouissance and the topology in seminar 16 on Fibonacci and Pascal. That this you got to remember, jouissance is a process of quantification. It's not a quality. That's not to say it is without, but like we're focused on the quantity, and that no matter what in the increasing and the decreasing series, we never get at this perfect ratio of what measurement of like what brings enjoyment and satisfaction. So I think that's like something that we could probably, now that like we've read both of those seminars, like put into mind about the problem of jouissance and like proper measurement and equanimity, to use Akshay's term. I think that was like brilliant. It just made me have a eureka moment. But yeah, like again, there's something always lost, or you're at a stalemate, with regards with jouissance.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, right? I mean, if it can be rationally defined, then we are back into the realm of the pleasure principle, right? And I think exactly, and I think this is a good link to the seminar 16, because with Pascal we have a similar thing going on, right? But it's precisely because it's the Fibonacci sequence has irrationality, right? It cannot be completely rationalized, right? So in that sense, it leads us to this beyond the pleasure principle, right?
Brilliant. You guys are getting pretty good at this shit. What's going on here? You guys gotta slow down, man.
It's the heavy weightlifting of Lacan seminars.
I know. It's like
Ronnie
Tupanamba
Coleman.
says, exercises in Lacanian thinking.
Ain't nothing but a peanut.
I know. I told my wife, I'm like, I don't go to the gym, but like, if all of my reading were equivalent to going to the gym, just imagine what my body would be. Just kidding. Okay, where are we at? We're about to encounter a very fun German word, a very Lacanian German word, actually. I wonder if this is the same word that Kant uses when describing the enthusiasm of the French Revolution. Go ahead, Matan.
I'll just say right before this, if anybody's interested, you gotta watch the Julie Taymor recreation or whatever of the Titus Andronicus Shakespeare play. Oh, so good, and especially with regards to what we're about to get into. But
Nice.
anyways, but Schwarmerein, black swarms. I chase you away in order to return to the function of presence in the Sadean fantasy. This fantasy has a structure that we will see again further on. In it, the object is but one of the terms in which the quest it figures can die out. When jouissance petrifies in the object, it becomes the black fetish, in which can be recognized the form that was verily and truly offered up at a certain time and place, and still is in our own time, so that one can adore the god therein. This is what becomes of the executioner in sadism when, in the most extreme case, his presence is reduced to being no more than an instrument. But the fact that the executioner's jouissance becomes fixated there does not spare his jouissance the humility of an act in which he cannot help but become a being of flesh and, to the very marrow, a slave to pleasure. This duplication neither reflects nor reciprocates, why wouldn't it mutualize, the duplication that took place in the other owing to the subject's two alterities. Desire, which is the henchman of the subject split, would no doubt be willing to call itself will to jouissance. But this appellation would not make desire any more worthy of the will it invokes in the other, in tempting that will to go right to the extreme of its division from its pathos, beyond the measurable. For when it does so, desire departs, beaten down, doomed to impotence. An infinite leap forward may not end up being that. For desire disappears under pleasure's sway, pleasure's law being such as to make it always fall short of its aim. The homeostasis of the living being, always too quickly reestablished at the lowest threshold of tension at which he scrapes by, the ever early fall of the wing with which desire is able to sign the reproduction of its form, a wing which here must nevertheless rise to the function of representing the link between sex and death. Let us lay that wing to rest behind its Eleusinian veil. Pleasure, a rival of the will in Kant's system that provides a stimulus, is thus in Sade's work no more than a flagging accomplice. At the moment of climax, it would simply be out of the picture if fantasy did not intervene to sustain pleasure with the very discord to which it succumbs. Stated differently, fantasy provides the pleasure that is characteristic of desire. Let us recall that desire is not the subject, for it cannot be indicated anywhere in a signifier of any demand whatsoever, for it cannot be articulated in the signifier, even though it is articulated there. Taking pleasure in fantasy is easy to grasp here. Physiology shows that pain has a longer cycle than pleasure in every respect, since a stimulation provokes pain at the point at which pleasure stops. However prolonged one assumes it to be, pain, like pleasure, nevertheless comes to an end when the subject passes out. Such is the vital datum that fantasy takes advantage of in order to fixate, in the sensory aspect of Sadean experience, the desire that appears in its agent. Fantasy is defined by the most general form it receives in an algebra I have constructed for this purpose, namely the formula of fantasy in which the losange, that little diamond, is to be read as desire for, being read right to left in the same way, introducing an identity that is based on an absolute non-reciprocity, again, despite being read right to left in the same way. Be that as it may, this form turns out to be particularly easy to animate in the present case. Indeed, it relates the pleasure that has been replaced by an instrument, object A in the formula, here to an instrument here to the kind of sustained division of the subject that experience orders. This only occurs when its apparent agent freezes with the rigidity of an object in view of having his division as a subject entirely reflected in the other. So I'll just say really quickly, the frozen rigidity has to do with, at the same time, a mortification of the body, but also its extension into the other. This only occurs when its apparent from the vantage point of the unconscious, a quadripartite structure can always be required in the construction of a subjective ordering. My didactic schemas take this into account. Let us modulate the Sadean fantasy with a new schema of this kind. And here we have the first of two schemas. If you notice, we have as Luis mentioned, the reverse of the S losange, right, on the bottom row there, connected by these curvy lines to V and S, and we'll get into what that is, as well as a D on the left. The lower line accounts for the order of fantasy insofar as it props up the utopia of desire. V to S, will to fully realized subject. The curvy line depicts the chain that allows for a calculus of the subject. It is oriented, and its orientation constitutes here an order in which the appearance of object A in the place of the cause is explained by the universality of its relationship to the category of causality. Forcing its way into Kant's transcendental deduction, this universality would base a new critique of reason on the linchpin of impurity. Next, there is the V, which, occupying the place of honor here, seems to impose the will that dominates the whole business, but its shape also evokes the union of what it divides by holding it together with the veil, namely, by offering up to choice what will create the barred S of practical reason from S, the brute subject of pleasure, the so-called pathological subject. Thus, it is clearly Kant's will that is encountered in the place of this will, that can only be said to be a will to jouissance, if we explain that it is the subject reconstituted through alienation at the cost of being nothing but the instrument of jouissance. Thus, Kant, being interrogated with Sade, that is, Sade serving here in our thinking as in his sadism, as an instrument, avows what is obvious in the question, what does he want, which henceforth arises for everyone. Let us now make use of this graph in its succinct form to find our way around in the forest of the fantasy that Sade develops according to a systematic plan in his work. I'll pause here. I see Luis has a question, or he's raising his hand.
Please.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting graph, right? So in Firen's book, The Jouissance Principle, he makes a, okay, so first of all, what is this graph? Like, is he just creating this graph? And actually, no. This graph is the L schema, which has been turned, right? So if you follow the L schema, you will see that
It usually goes from the opposite direction.
Yes, and the line crossing, right? That will be the line of
The imaginary wall of language in the L schema.
yeah. So that's the, if he says the enunciation, right? So that's the enunciation, and the line that there is no line, of course, that goes from the little a to the S on top, right?
It's not turned upside down, it's turned to the side.
Yeah,
It's
it's turned to the side, right?
Yeah.
So
It's very strange. Like, you would have to actually be better to read it like this. Like, that's how it's normally taken, right?
Almost like it's an end schema.
It's a useful yeah, right. I mean, the L schema is really useful for thinking the kind of movement of the subject in the Lacanian universe. And anyways, continue, Luis, with your articulation on this, please.
yeah, so the idea that I got is that wait. Well, just
So
one
the
second. You can continue. Let me just check the book.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, typically it's a movement through the three registers in the proper sequence, moving from imaginary symbolic to real, and then there is like typically a dotted line from real back to the origin point, or there's a crisscrossing back.
yeah, and in this sense, it's only in one direction.
Yeah,
And
there's that issue.
so
Yeah.
and so my question is, because you obviously see that there is a lozenge, which means that there is no connection between Bart
Mhm.
and A, which maintains the fundamental fantasy. I guess my question is like, what does the D as initiating A represent? Is it desire, not demand, right? Because usually demand is a capital D, correct?
Capital D.
It's a capital D. So it's desire addressing little a as the delta, which would initiate the circuit. And V represents what? Because you mentioned something regarding to Kant.
Yeah,
Well,
V
Yeah.
is will.
it means what?
Will.
Wheel.
The will.
The
Yeah.
will. The will. The will.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So it's about the first movement is the incorporation of the fantasy so that the transcendental deduction can occur with it, which is in the Kantian movement would not be included. Then the second movement up is to will. Then we have the production of the split subject as de Sade develops it. But sorry, Luis, go. You can jump in, please.
Yes, because I was checking the French version and I got confused because in the French is énoncé, énonciation, and in English is the statement. Anyways, so the line that crosses, right, that's the statement, right? Because in the case of the L schema, right, whenever one speaks, right, there is no real connection between oneself, right? It needs to go through language. So it's language, the one that bars, right, a complete access, right? So the access will be between A, the voice, and the pathological subject, the S, right? So this is impossible because you always have to go through the statement, through language, right? So language bars this possibility, and that's why it needs to go that way, right? So yeah, so the D is desire, right? And desire, and this is what Kant represents, the fact that there is a desire acting upon the voice, right? And then, of course, then the voice goes to the will, and this is normally how Kant understands that. Then the will, right? I declare the categorical imperative, and this must be followed by myself, right? Because the categorical imperative is about oneself, right? It's not about someone else. If I go and tell someone else to act in how I think, that's not a categorical imperative, right? So it goes to the divided subject, right? Divided subject that needs to follow the statement of the will, and this produces the pathological subject, right? The S on top, and this is the S and the voice, of course, is that the line that doesn't exist is that of enunciation, right? So that's the enunciated subject, right? So the subject, the body, the one that speaks, right? Is the one that is produced and needs to be rejected, right? Because for Kant to be unconditionally free, you need to reject any sensible inclinations. Therefore, also your pathological inclinations, right? So this is the pathological subject that needs to be excluded, right? So what is interesting here, well, there are many things interesting here, but particularly interesting is that what is new with Sade is the enunciated subject, right? The one that is no possible connection, right? That it needs to go through language, through the statement. And the other thing, of course, interesting is the inversion of the fantasy. Like the neurotic fantasy goes from the barred subject to A, and here is inverse. And that's why, of course, many people claim that it is linked to perversion, because perversion inverses the fantasy, right? well, it's not important overall, right? It's essential, right?
Was this articulated in that text that you shared in the Discord? The
Yeah,
secondary
yeah.
literature?
In the book, the jouissance principle, he's very good
Yeah, the
explaining
jouissance
that.
principle, right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. It's very, very good.
Andrew.
Yeah, my question actually goes out to Luis. So like, you know, it makes sense because you mentioned, like, you clarified that the V is the will, and also you could align it with the voice because it's usually like this internalized or voice that's like of the other, but still like what's in some sense internalized. So like, you know, you said that like this is like also flips the formula for fantasy on the other side. So it's like not S addressing A, but ultimately the arrow is going up to the bard S is going up to a pathological subject. So it's like is perversion no matter what, even though it holds a sort of reversal on the side of the fundamental fantasy, always on the side of a pathological act. Because like right here, right? So if Bard S doesn't address lozenge A, it's the desire, but the desire what? It's the other's desire addressing this little a of jouissance, right? That goes up to the goodwill, which is also aligned with, as you said, the voice, if I'm understanding right. So like for the pervert, it's the other's desire meeting the voice, to which a bard subject is meeting up to a pathological act or a pathological subject, right? Versus the neurotic, who only addresses little a as a sort of semblance of the other. Does that make sense? Like I'm trying to understand like the distinction and how this like schema is operating.
I mean, the neurotic, of course. If we
Not to say
think
the
about
neurotic doesn't do anything pathological, right? It's yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, the neurotic, if we follow the superego, right, is not exactly the categorical imperative, right, but it follows the same structure, right. Of course, the superego of the neurotic is not exactly oneself, right. You don't need to create a maxim, right. It's pretty much the internalization of the paternal figure, right, and therefore you're not the one that takes that role, right? So it's always the other speaking to you, and you're therefore guilty for not standing up to that ideal of the paternal figure. But what is interesting, of course, is that the introduction of the paternal figure redirects the libido, right? So when the father is punishing you, it is you or your unconscious that is enjoying, right? So there is always a tension about desire, right? And the underlying desire behind the superego. The other thing that he mentioned and is that in this graph, the lower part is unconscious, right? So that's crucial
Yes.
because the will, and that's something else, right? What is the role of the unconscious in Kant? No, it's not the Lacanian unconscious, certainly, right? Therefore, the A is down there because it's unconscious, right? It's unconscious for the will, and therefore it follows this chain of causations: unconscious, conscious, then to the unconscious of the other, and then to the conscious, the pathological subject that is conscious, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Last thing I'll say, it's interesting because like he does something, he shows a similar schema to this. It's not this sort of flip side L schema, but he shows like two versions of like for the neurotic, it is the fundamental fantasy, but then on the other side, the perverted fantasy or the perverted act is A and a big S, because what he's getting at in seminar 10 is like showing the distinction between the two, and how the difference between the neurotic versus the pervert relates to the other. And of course, for the neurotic, in anxiety, the Unheimlich, it's their desire, but it can only be seen from the vantage point of the other. So little a, the object cause of desire, is seen as a part of their subjectivity from the position of the other. Example is the wolfman's dream of the wolf's gazing back on him, which it's all too uncanny, unheimlich, it's all too at home and outside of home at the same time. But this is like totally different from the pervert, who's seems to be on this other axis, to where like it's addressing enjoyment in some sense and desire directly.
And precisely because the neurotic needs to repress desire, and in a sense needs to repress the desire of the other, right? What does the other really want from me? The neurotic will try to avoid this question, right? And therefore, or answer it more than anything else, right? And that's why Kant, at the end, if we continue, when well, I will not spoil the story, but
Yeah, let's continue, Matan, because we're getting to like this weird extinguishing moment of desire, and then the dark side of the Sidian fantasy is beginning to emerge here. So where were we? We were at thus it is clearly Kant's will. Is that where we were? Or
I think
were
we're a
we?
little bit below there, but I'll do that
Why
paragraph
don't you
just to
start
like
over
kind
at thus? Yeah, why don't you actually why don't you start at the very top of 654, the curvy line depicts.
the curvy line depicts the chain that allows for a calculus of the subject. And just to be clear, that's different than the libido, the quantitative factor of the libido that is discharged in the enunciation of the subject. It is oriented, and its orientation constitutes here an order in which the appearance of object A in the place of the cause is explained by the universality of its relationship to the category of causality. Forcing its way into Kant's transcendental deduction, this universality would base a new critique of reason on the linchpin of impurity, critique. Next,
Got
there
it.
is
So that's movement 1.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. Everyone's good on that?
Well,
Is-
as Andrew mentioned, there's also D to A, which I don't know if he mentions later. I did read this, but
Yeah, D to A, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
um,
But that's the incorporation of the pathological object inside of the
yes.
transcendental deduction.
I kind of understand. Yeah, Aristotle says something. He says, and he maybe quotes someone else. It's not that we desire what's beautiful because we impose our vision of beauty on it, but we desire the beautiful because it is beautiful, right? And I think it's that kind of framework that is being worked with here, but I would have to actually look at this more.
Well, the transcendental deduction also brings us back to this question that Connor had about the place, right? The situation in which it takes place, the bedroom versus the classroom versus anywhere. Why is the voice not portrayed on this schema?
what do you mean it's not? Like it is the A.
I see. So it's already internal to the A. I see.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
object
well,
A, is the voice.
Object A is voicing gaze, and especially for the pervert.
Yeah, in this case, it's voice, the one that's speaking, right? Or the speaking subject, let's put it that way, right? Here.
no, I know, but like the voice as third entity that he was articulating before. Okay, fine. It's all interior to the A. That's fine. Okay. Please continue.
Thus, it is clearly Kant's will that is encountered in the place of this will that can only
No,
be said.
you were at next. There is the V.
Next, there's the V, which, occupying the place of honor here, seems to impose the will that dominates the whole business, but its shape also evokes the union. It is the logical signifier of unions, of what it divides by holding it together with a veil, namely, by offering up to choice what will create the barred subject of practical reason from the full subject, the brute subject of pleasure, the pathological subject. Thus, it is clearly Kant's will that is encountered in the place of this will, that can only be said to be a will to jouissance, if we explain that it is the subject reconstituted through alienation at the cost of being nothing but the instrument of jouissance.
Okay, got it. So that's the downward movement from V to barred subject with losange.
Yeah, although I'll say later on, it does seem like he's kind of at the same time going to start working backwards from S. That's how I read it, but we'll be able to, yeah. Thus, Kant being interrogated with Sade, that is, Sade serving here in our thinking as in his sadism, as an instrument, avows what is obvious in the question, what does he want, which henceforth arises for everyone.
Yes, we know that that is the case because that's present in the maxim from the get-go, as it were. Like a new universalization that is encompassing of the problem of pleasure, which was foreclosed in the Kantian transcendental deduction. Okay.
Let us now make use of this graph in its succinct form to find our way around in the forest of the fantasy that Sade develops according to a systematic plan in his work. We will see that there is a statics of the fantasy whereby the point of aphonesis, assumed to lie in the bard's subject, must in one's imagination...
And that is this question, which is not really articulated too well, of the desexualization, which is a super important moment in the whole thing. Kind of a horrific moment, really. Everything is changing now, right? Go ahead. I guess this is sort of where they, well, go ahead.
I don't know. And he also like starts adopting like a more like punitive legal voice as we go.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I totally get what you're saying. This explains the hardly believable survival that Sade grants to the victims of the abuse and tribulations he inflicts in his fable. The moment of their death seems to be motivated there merely by the need to replace them in a combinatory, which alone requires their multiplicity. Whether unique, Justine, or multiple, the victim is characterized by the monotony of the subject's relation to the signifier, in which, if we rely on our graph, she consists. The troupe of tormentors, see Juliet, being object A in the fantasy and situating themselves in the real, can have more variety. The requirement that the victim's faces always be of incompatible and, moreover, unalterable, as I just said, beauty, is another matter, which we cannot account for with a few banal and quickly fabricated postulates about sex appeal. Rather, we should see here the grimace of what I have shown regarding the function of beauty in tragedy, the ultimate barrier that forbids access to a fundamental horror. Consider Sophocles' Antigone and the moment when the words Eros, you are unconquerable, or love, you are unconquerable, ring out. This excursus would be of no value here. They did not introduce what one might call the discordance between the two deaths, introduced by the existence of the condemnation. The between two deaths of the shy of is essential to show us that it is no other than the one by which the beyond is sustained. This can be clearly seen in the paradox constituted in Sade's work by his position regarding hell. The idea of hell, refuted 100 times by him and cursed as religious tyranny's way of constraining people, curiously returns to explain the gestures of one of his heroes, who is nevertheless among the most taken with libertine subversion in its reasonable form, the hideous Saint Fond. The practices whose final agony he imposes on his victims are based on his belief that he can render their torment eternal in the hereafter. Saint Fond highlights the authenticity of this behavior by concealing it from his accomplices, and the authenticity of this credence by the difficulty he has explaining himself. Thus we hear him, a few pages later, try to make his behavior and credence sound plausible in his discourse, with the myth of an attraction tending to gather the particles of evil. This incoherence in Sade's work, overlooked by sadists, they too are a bit hagiographic, could be explained by noting in his writings the formally expressed term, the second death. The assurance he expects from it against the awful routine of nature, which crime, as he tells us elsewhere, serves to disrupt, would require that it go to an extreme in which the vanishing of the subject is redoubled. He symbolizes this in his wish that the very decomposed elements of our body be destroyed so that they can never again be assembled.
Okay. All right, so this is resonating with those of us that have read the ethics seminar on Antigone and the two deaths, which, yes. Very interesting. Okay. So Matan, when you say that he's now working in reverse,
I don't. So basically, when I say he's working in reverse, I don't want to like impose like a singular vision of how he's like working with this diagram. I just know that there's at certain points where he wants to talk about the barred subject and how it's like working in this chain, specifically from like the pretext of it's like falling away, of being emitted from the lack of a rapport between V and S.
Yeah.
He mentions that once, but I would also say that's just like what I'm picking up on, and there's more to this than that. Although in some sense, I think the right move here is like a better way of reducing things rather than complexifying. But
Right, because ultimately, like the barred subject's from like an alienated position. So, like in the first graph, the barred subject is at the right corner and is being addressed by this desire and the little A going through the V down there. But I mean, he'll show in a later graph, like it's the subject can only be addressed and move through the other's desire, especially if it's neurotic. Um, and that's the split subject, split between, you know, I mean, science and truth, knowledge and truth, the truth, you know, of itself, and then, you know, knowledge that it wishes to acquire from other. But in this sense, it's like between something and the pathological subject, right? Or the pathological act, right? Something along the lines of the goodwill, is desire for the goodwill and a pathological thing.
Luis,
Yeah, what is interesting here is that Juliet or Justine, like Antigone, they are characters of these between two deaths, right? Precisely because in the case of Justine, right, she keeps her modesty, right? In among all the tortures that are happening to her, right? She nonetheless keeps her modesty, keeps her doesn't just give up her goodwill, right? And this is particularly what drives the sadist, right? In Sade's novels, right? They're always trying to torture because there is always an infinite quality of goodness that cannot be destroyed, right? And that's why Sade's notion of hell is in relationship to this belief that there is nonetheless this heaven he needs to destroy. That's why he brings up the second that he wants to destroy all forms of goodness, right? And he wants to also take his death to be part of that, right? He wants to destroy this cosmological view of the world, right? So in that sense, he still nonetheless believes a lot in hell and heaven, right? And these metaphysical ideas he's trying to destroy.
But the two deaths for de Sade are distinct from Antigone's conception of two deaths. Because in the conception of Antigone's notion of two deaths is not the idea about this refusal of the rights of the death of the brother, and sort of like this sort of like this like rebellion against the social symbolic rights of the first death. But then there's like this insistence upon a beyond precisely of what the social would allow. That's my recollection of Antigone's conception of two deaths. That there is a desire that cannot be eradicated by Creon, by the power, by the law. And so she exists in a space that is aiming beyond the law. In this instance, it's less clear to me because once we have the split between the signifier and the pathological subject, meaning the subject constituted after the will to jouissance inhabits their body, there's like a moment or a movement of a desexualization. And it's quite catastrophic. And in a certain way, desire is expunged. But maybe I'm kind of struggling to understand the position of the law. in this operation, where it seems to be that pleasure is all that remains. Maybe somebody could help us, or help me at least articulate that.
Well, I haven't read Justine like forever, but if I'm not mistaken, isn't like Justine and her sister, like her sister becomes like sort of like she like inherits like not some wealth, but like she like ends up like mingling with a lot of libertines and like aristocrats to where like Justine's disgusted. So like Justine has like no symbolic order in society because like they became like their parents or their family died like at a young age, so they became like on their own. But it's like Justine doesn't have no symbolic role necessary in society, and every time she's like encountering people in like some position, she
No, I thought that was the opposite. I thought that the position of Justine was that she went through the Sadean torture, but maintained a foothold
oh, okay.
of dignity in the social field, which would be the opposite of Antigone.
Okay, yeah, like I said, I haven't read in forever, but
But I mean, but Antigone, yes, not in the law of humans, right? As Hegel talks about in the moral law, the universal law, right? So in that sense, yeah, she maintains the promise, or I don't know, the moral law, right?
Oh,
And
right. She meant
she
yes.
yeah.
Yes,
So
exactly.
Antigone and Justine are very similar because, okay, let's say Justine has the torture is, let's say, Sade, and in the case of Antigone is Creon, right? And they bear the suffering. And I think he later, Lacan says that at the end, the victims are bored to death. And that's pretty much what happens with the Athanasis, right? They no longer feel pleasure because at the end it is the sadist who is enjoying it, right?
That would explain why so many commentators have referred to the Sadean universe as a neurotic universe. Given that neurosis is associated with desexualization in a certain movement. Connor, please.
Yeah, so I'm just like I'm just talking out loud, but um if you remember earlier in talking about this position within the bedroom, Lacan basically says like there is no equivalence in the bedroom in regards to reciprocal relations, right? Um, but I find in this moment on 654, whether unique, Justine, or multiple, the victim is characterized by the monotony of the subject's relation to the signifier, in which, if we rely on her graft, she consists. Um, it seems as though then there's a sort of like affirmation of equivalence between the status of the victim going on here, right? And I think sort of what is at issue then, because like even though there is this, Justine is unique, when she's reduced to a victim, she's just like any other victim. And so I think what's going on here is this sort of problem of authenticity. And I think there's also a consequence that then of the constitution of the subject through alienation. It's as though like being reduced to alienation, really, this is a problem of reification. You know, what is the quality of the respective status of people, etc. And yeah, maybe just to talk a little bit more on this authenticity. The practices whose final agony he imposes on his victims are based on his belief that he can render their torment eternal in the hereafter. He highlights the authenticity of this behavior of subjecting people to becoming victims by concealing it from his accomplices, and the authenticity of this credence by the difficulty he has explaining himself. So it's in concealing how you are making people into victims that you have a kind of authenticity that others do not. So being emphasized here is the authenticity of the sadist, but also emphasized is this concealing work, right? It's in hiding that work, that and in trying to explain that concealing, that you get a level of authenticity. Like,
but where does the authenticity come from? Does it come from the fact that you are sanctioning, does it come from the relationship that you have about the sadistic drive itself, which takes us back to the very beginning of the text, where he says that Freud it would take until Freud to make like a science out of the object that de Sade is working with, which I referenced the Beyond the Pleasure Principle point about the death drive often being referred to as the sadistic drive or associated with evil. So is the authenticity emerging from that like knowledge of that maybe, or how do you understand authenticity? Because authenticity is not a Lacanian word.
Yeah. I mean,
But go ahead.
it seems more of like an existential sort of word, right?
Oh,
Authenticity.
totally. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know, that my mind is going back again to this question of what is revealed through humor, through jokes, right? And Lacan said that Sade's pamphlet reads like of the gallows humor, like dark humor. And so I think what's going on here is like what is being evoked, obviously, is for it's like the joke work, right? Which is, basically just a return of the press through jokes, in everyday life. But what is being revealed in jokes, I think, is just a form of domination, right? Or like how it is that social conventions coerce us to behave in certain ways, right? Which can be exposed through jokes, right? But cannot be talked about apparently or explicitly otherwise,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know. That's just a couple of things.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that would yeah, the conception of the veil by offering up a choice that will create the barred subject of practical reason from the S, the brute subject of pleasure. One can see that operation, precisely because it is imposing a conception of choice, you could see how jokes would fit there in a certain way. I guess that does make sense, actually. Akshay, please.
I had a few different things to say, but I mean, like to start off with the bit that Connor was just talking about, and I mean, yeah, I think it is this kind of like, I mean, we know it's authentic because he was trying to hide it, right? Like, and I guess like the logic there is sort of like, was he doing it for like the acclaim of his libertine friends, or did he want to do it? Like in the way how he did it, what can we sort of read about what his desire was? And that it was sort of hidden sort of implicates him because, well, why did he have to hide it? And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess like when he starts the chapter, Lacan, I mean, like it's not, he kind of goes like, it's not exactly Freud that like Sade is very much like, that he's much closer to Kant, right? Like, and I don't know, we were having this conversation about pleasure, I guess, like, and there's the bottom of 652 where he draws a contrast between Kant and Sade, where he's like, pleasure, a rival of the will in Kant's system that provides a stimulus, is thus in Sade's work no more than a flagging accomplice. At the moment of climax, it will simply be out of the picture if fantasy did not intervene to sustain it with the very discord to which it succumbs. So I mean, so pleasure is actually least important for Sade, right? Like in the sense that he's like kind of interested in the perpetuation of the fantasy. In what sense is Sade more authentic than Kant? He's not permissible in polite society. And precisely because he has to be hidden. I mean, because like what he speaks to is like, okay, you said the law for law's sake. Here's a absolutely crazy person talking about he's very kind of like who he is, like is authentic because he needs to be censored. I mean, which isn't to say that he doesn't need to be censored, but it speaks to the ambivalent nature of what Kant sort of hides, like in this idea of like, oh, the categorical imperative, we're all just going to sort of, I don't know. But I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a conclusion to this thought, but I guess
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you for that. That actually resonates now.
Right.
Building off that really does help me, yes. Especially this point about social conventions and yes, and this point is about honesty. He says that he's more honest about it. Okay.
But if I may add something,
Yeah.
I think we also need to also add to the fact that he says the difficulty he has explaining himself, right? And I think if we again if we read it as a pervert who is not trying to repress or who thinks not repressing, right? And as we can see, Sade is more honest, right? But nonetheless, even with his honesty, he has difficulty explaining what he wants, right? What he wants from his victims, right? And that's the authenticity that nonetheless there is the desire needs to be concealed, right? And that's why there is difficulty that is, of course, a part of language itself, part of the divided subject, right? So I think that's the issue, right?
Can somebody explain in a clear sense the disillusion of desire towards the latter part of the movement of this inverted L scheme? I mean, I think I get it in a certain way. You have this division between the signifier and the pathological subject, where the will to jouissance is kind of repeated, but now jouissance becomes almost like quantifiable. And that seems to lead to or cause a breakdown in the Sadean system. But that's actually by its design. It's meant to be something that breaks down. It's not something that's per se, because you first off, you would say, oh, it's an instrument. So therefore, it's meant to be functional. One question I would have is like, is this instrument meant to be functional? Or is it actually an instrument like the Joker from Bat? Like it's actually an instrument for destruction?
I think that's what it mostly is, because the one thing about, like, I think Luis has said it before, but it's like the pervert doesn't need to necessarily like desire in the sense that they lack and they wish to be fulfilled like a neurotic does, because they're on the side of they have the knowledge of enjoyment, so they just instrumentalize it or become instrumentalized.
Okay. But on the side of the victims, though,
Like,
causes a profound
one
disillusion.
line, like, I mean, there's perversion, but like I feel like also what's sort of operative here is like a crime against nature, right? Like, I mean, I don't know, there's like a sort of like even punk resonance to that. I mean, it's not that Sade's making, I don't know, great music and not murdering a bunch of people, but nonetheless, like it's kind of but yeah, I mean, like the idea seems to be like the crime against nature, where like, but I mean, yeah, and it does like yeah, invite, I mean, you know, it is imminently a sort of breakdown, right? Like in that sense, but
Okay. Let's see. So we're gonna continue for about 12 more minutes. And we'll get to where we get to. I don't obviously want to rush this. And we still have a decent amount to go, in fact.
Could I mention something, Daniel?
Yes, of course, Matilda, please.
I am a bit lost, but I wanted to point out and wonder what people thought about when he first introduces the schema, how you see how the utopia of desire is propped up.
Yeah.
And what I take the utopia of desire to be is like the Sadean universe of like his form of revolutionary politics that's like organized somehow around this imperative.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But then I feel as if Lacan's not describing the breakdown of it too well.
Fair. Yeah.
That's my point of confusion, to be frank.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah, I feel like really what's missing from Lacan that I happened to think of when you guys were talking was the gaze, because really what is so striking if you actually read the de Sade novels is the way he's using like the persecutors, their own like kind of predicament where they have to lie over and over again. He's using this in like pretty conventional way we understand like horror movies, like they're saying, or just kind of this sort of tension in film we understand where they're like, or literature where they're saying something false, but we know the opposite is true, blah blah blah. But then I think that the castration of this subject, the symbolic castration, is kind of enacted. And when we talk about the split between de Sade and Kant, we have to think about it not in terms of, I think, like something that's self-evident, but what de Sade himself is staging, because there's two parts to all of his stories. There's the parts where, you know, the tormentors keep getting away with it by just telling like progressively insane lies that they eventually kind of lose control of. But then at the same time, that there's this like equivalent sense of like frustrated enjoyment you get as the victim becomes more and more knowledgeable about their status as this kind of like a black fetish for this other person to kind of like to pretend that they want, only for to like get into this bureaucratic task that they don't really say they enjoy, but it's, you know, they love scheming, plotting, being conspirators with each other. That's what ultimately makes the reading experience like one that grabs your attention. At least that's what I found.
I see. I see. Okay, yeah, so perhaps maybe that
But Lacan doesn't mention that at all, right?
no,
But,
the contradiction of the Sadean instrument is bound up with its, on the one hand, universal foothold in the utopia of desire, and on the other hand, this criminality, which is trying to have a destructive gesture made and to objectify its victims, right? So one naturally can't think the unity of those two operations too easily. Okay. Why don't we read this a tad bit more, and then we shall close in about 10 minutes.
sure, where was I? The executioner? Does anyone remember? Oh, no. Yes. This can be clearly seen, and we're talking about the two deaths here. Actually, let me go a little bit further down. This incoherence in Sade's work, overlooked by sadists, even now I'm a little bit behind, but that's okay, could be explained by noting in his writings the formally expressed term, the second death. The assurance
So he actually says that, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
The assurance he expects from it against the awful routine of nature, which crime, as he tells us elsewhere, serves to disrupt, would require that it go to an extreme in which the vanishing of the subject is redoubled.
Aha.
He symbolizes this in his wish that the very decomposed elements of our body be destroyed so that they can never again be assembled. The fact that,
and remember, I'm going to try to get her on the Emancipations. What's her name? Tracy McNulty has this wonderful analysis of de Sade's desire to be buried in an unmarked gravesite so that his remains, are never gazed upon by another, but also this operation on nature is also operating on his own body too. Like it's like a full it's something about fusion with the mother, and she links that to the perverse structure. So it's like the ultimate freedom or ultimate letting go or something like that, which was otherwise never able to be achieved. So that, then that introduces us to the second death, because the second death then for de Sade. Let's do some research on second death for Antigone versus de Sade, just as a refresher.
The Levian school claimed that for Lacan and also for Antigone, the second death comes before the first death. Like the first death being the biological death, right? Because second death is symbolic death, right?
Right.
And Sade cannot understand, cannot conceive of this symbolic nature, right? He doesn't see the division, right? And therefore, for him not to be buried, right, or for his body to be destroyed, is to make sure that after he dies, there is no remaining of anything good within him, right? So he really believes in this goodness.
Yeah. Please. Yeah, thank you.
the fact that Freud nevertheless recognizes the dynamism of this wish in certain of his clinical cases, and that he very clearly, perhaps too clearly, reduces its function to something analogous to the pleasure principle by relating it to a death drive, a demand for death as an escape from monotony. But this isn't the case, he says, Lacan. This will not be accepted by those who have been unable to learn from the technique they owe Freud or from his teachings, that language has effects that are not simply utilitarian or, at the very most, for purposes of display. Freud is only of use to them at conventions. In the eyes of such puppets, the millions of men for whom the pain of existence is the original reason for the practices of salvation that they base on their faith in Buddha are undoubtedly underdeveloped, or rather, they think like Buloz, the director of La Revue des Deux Mondes, who told Renan straight out when he turned down his article on Buddhism, this according to Bernouf, at some point during the 1850s, that it is impossible that there are people that dumb. If they believe that they have better ears than other psychiatrists, have they somehow escaped hearing such pain in a pure state model, the song of certain patients referred to as melancholic? Have they not heard one of those dreams by which the dreamer remains overwhelmed, having, in the felt condition of an inexhaustible rebirth, plumbed the depths of the pain of existence? Or, in order to put hell's torments back in their place, torments which could never be imagined beyond what men traditionally inflict in this world, shall we implore them to think of our everyday life as having to be eternal? We must hope for nothing, not even hopelessness, to combat such stupidity, which is, in the end, sociological. I am mentioning it here only so that people on the outside will not expect too much concerning Sade from the circles of those who have a sure experience of forms of sadism, especially regarding a certain equivocal notion that has been gaining ground about the relation of reversion that supposedly unites sadism with a certain idea of masochism. It is difficult for those outside such circles to imagine the muddle this notion creates. We would do better to learn from it the lesson contained in a fine little tale told about the exploitation of one man by another, which is the definition of capitalism as we know. And socialism, then, it is the opposite. Unintended humor. This is the tone with which a certain circulation of psychoanalysis occurs. It fascinates people because it goes, moreover, unnoticed. But there are doctrinaires who strive for tidier appearances. One acts the part of a do-good existentialist, another, more soberly, that of a ready-made personalist. This results in the claim that the sadist, quote, denies the other's existence, unquote, which is precisely, one must admit, what has just come out in my analysis. To pursue my analysis, is it not the case, rather, that the sadist discharges the pain of existence into the other, but without seeing that he himself thereby turns into an eternal object? If Whitehead was willing to let us have this term back. But why wouldn't it belong to both of us? Isn't this, redemption and immortal soul, the status of the Christian? Let's not proceed too quickly, so as not to go too far either. Let us note instead that Sade is not duped by his fantasy, insofar as the rigor of his thinking is integrated into the logic of his life. Let me give my readers an assignment here. The fact that Sade delegates a right to jouissance to everyone in his republic is not translated in my graph by any symmetrical reversal along an axis or around some central point, but only by a 90-degree rotation of the graph as follows. Schema 2. Okay, yep. V, the will to jouissance, leaves no further doubt as to its nature, because it appears in the moral force implacably exercised by the president of Montreuil, Sade's mother-in-law, on the subject. It can be seen that the subject's division does not have to be pinned together in a single body. Let us note that it is only the first consul who seals this division with its effect of administratively confirmed alienation. This division here pins together as S the brute subject incarnating the heroism characteristic of the pathological in the form of faithfulness to Sade manifested by those who at first tolerated his excesses, his wife, his sister-in-law, and why not his manservant too, and others who have been effaced from his history. For Sade, the bard S, we finally see that as a subject, it is through his disappearance that he makes his mark, things having come to their term. Incredibly, Sade disappears without anything, even less than for Shakespeare, of his image remaining to us, after he gave orders in his will to have a thicket efface the very last trace on stone of a name that sealed his fate.
Okay. Yeah, so he denied the second death in some sense. Because the second death is about, yeah, it's about the symbolic. Wow. Okay. So we have to reread this next time we get together. I don't know. I want to close because we've been together for almost 2 hours. But this is a nice point for us to continue to reflect. Um, yeah. Quite a lot of good things, huh? How are you guys finding this?
That's really good. Yeah.
It's pretty wild. Yeah, it's pretty wild. I know, like the last time that I read it, I was very much tied up in the ethics seminar, and I felt like I didn't treat Sade on like Sade's own terms, meaning that like I didn't read his own works and stuff like that. So now it's like a totally different approach. So yeah. Um,
Can I add that?
please.
I mean, for us to think later, that this new graph is about Sade himself, right?
Yes.
It's not about the Sade of his novels, right? Because the Sade of his novels is
It's not about the
the
victims.
yeah, is the sadist, right? Well,
Right.
here is Sade as an object, right? Because this is what he represses. That nonetheless he becomes the eternal object that he wants to destroy, right? In the other all the time, he is this object, the object of whom, of course, of his mother-in-law, right? And that's the other turn.
Mm.
So, and is in that sense, because that's why they talk about when Lacan talks about before about the relationship of sadism and masochism as their opposites.
Yeah.
This is Freud, right? And no, for Lacan, the truth of sadism is masochism, right? And in the same here, right? The truth of the sadist novels is that they cannot accept this more deep masochism, right? They need to place the pain on the other, right, as a way to rejecting their own pain, right? But nonetheless, in real life, Sade, of course, was the object of the mother-in-law. And it will be fun to relate it back to the story of the New Yorker, right? And this very strange relationship between not only the mother-in-law, but also the wife, right?
Yeah.
And
Because
how she calls her my little boy.
I know, yeah. Well, the mother-in-law was crazy because what was it? He stole the virginity of her favorite daughter, and then she was the one that got him imprisoned like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it doesn't. It might start with the mother-in-law, but it is sealed by the first consul, the division of the subject, right?
Oh yeah.
So there's something that is like, I guess this is what we're getting at, which is that his inability to see himself represented by the state had to.
Ah,
Yeah, I think that had something. I mean, there's the basic like
yeah.
introduction of the sexual that psychoanalysis is kind of like axiomatically believes in, and I think that is basically his like chief contribution to like Kant here.
Mm-hmm.
And
No,
it's
that's very nice.
yeah.
Wow. Wow. My head is spinning. This is crazy. But I'm into it. Yeah. Okay. Fabulous. Thank you guys. We pick it up next week.
See ya.
All the best.